The headlines treat them as separate stories. Venezuela sanctions here, Iran pressure there, currency disputes somewhere else. Each event is framed as a local crisis with its own explanation. That framing is misleading by design. This is not a collection of random disputes. It is a pattern of pressure applied across finance, trade, energy, and infrastructure. When viewed together, these moves form a coherent strategy rather than reactive policy. The goal is not persuasion but control. The United States describes this approach as national security. Critics describe it as economic warfare. Both descriptions point to the same reality. Economic systems are now the primary battlefield of global power. The dollar sits at the center of that battlefield. It is not just a currency but a gatekeeper. Access to dollars determines access to trade. Banking, insurance, and global markets. Control the dollar system, and you influence the world. For decades, this system functioned with minimal resistance. Countries accepted dollar dominance because it offered stability, liquidity, and predictability. Participation was voluntary, and benefits were real. The system worked because it felt neutral. That neutrality ended when sanctions became routine. Freezing reserves, blocking payments, and seizing assets transformed finance into a weapon. Once money could be denied for political reasons, trust began to erode. Alternatives stopped being optional and became necessary. Iran experienced this shift earlier than most. Sanctions isolated its banks, restricted oil sales, and cut off dollar access. Survival required adaptation rather than compliance. Iran learned how to trade under pressure. Oil became the testing ground. Selling energy without touching the dollar was once unthinkable. Iran proved it was possible through barter, local currencies, and intermediaries. Every transaction bypassing the dollar weakened its monopoly. Russia took notice after 2014 and accelerated after 2022, sanctions forced Moscow to redesign its trade architecture. Energy exports were rerouted, currencies diversified, and payment systems localized. What began as punishment became a catalyst. China observed these cases carefully. Unlike Iran or Russia, China did not face immediate isolation. Instead, it planned for future risk. Preparation mattered more than speed. China's strategy focused on infrastructure rather than confrontation. Ports, railways, power grids, and digital networks came first. Financial systems followed physical ones. Control of trade routes reduced dependence on foreign approval. Currency swaps quietly expanded. Bilateral agreements reduced dollar usage without public drama. Each agreement was small on its own. Together, they formed a parallel network. The cross-border interbank payment system was not built to replace SWIFT overnight. It was designed to coexist. Volume increased slowly, credibility built quietly, and redundancy emerged naturally. By the time tensions rose, the system already worked. BRICS emerged as a coordination platform rather than an alliance. Its members share little ideology but common incentives. All experienced vulnerability inside the dollar system. All sought flexibility without collapse. Brazil's concern was volatility. Dollar swings destabilized domestic markets and punished growth. Reducing exposure was economic self-defense. Politics played a secondary role. India pursued balance rather than rebellion. It maintained U.S. ties while expanding local currency trade. This reduced risk without forcing alignment. Strategic autonomy became the priority. South Africa viewed dollar dominance through development constraints. Capital flight and debt servicing drained growth. Financial independence meant policy freedom. That freedom mattered more than loyalty. Gold returned to relevance in this environment. Central banks increased reserves at record speed. Gold cannot be sanctioned or frozen. Its value lies in neutrality, not nostalgia. The United States responded with pressure rather than reform. Sanctions expanded, enforcement tightened, and warnings multiplied. Short-term compliance increased. Long-term trust declined. Every sanction sends a message beyond its target. It tells others what could happen to them. That message accelerates preparation. Fear produces obedience today and resistance tomorrow. The dollar remains dominant, but dominance is no longer unquestioned. Monopoly power erodes gradually, then suddenly. History shows no reserve currency lasts forever. Transitions begin quietly. This moment feels chaotic because the system is mid-transition. Old rules still function while new ones emerge underneath. Both coexist uncomfortably. That tension defines the current era. What looks like financial fragmentation is actually diversification. Countries are spreading risk, not declaring war. Survival, not ideology, drives decisions. Structure matters more than speeches. The global financial system is not collapsing. It is rebalancing under pressure. Power is diffusing, not disappearing. And once diffusion begins, reversal becomes unlikely. This is the context behind BRICS versus the dollar. Not a sudden rebellion, but a long response. Not ideology, but incentives. And not the end of the dollar, but the end of its exclusivity. The pressure on the United States dollar is not emerging from a single crisis, but from dozens of quiet structural changes happening at the same time. Governments that once depended entirely on dollar settlement are now experimenting with alternatives to reduce exposure. These experiments are rarely announced publicly and often framed as technical adjustments. Over time, these adjustments accumulate into systemic change. The BRICS group has become the central platform where these adjustments begin to align. Its members are not united by ideology or military alliances. They are united by shared exposure to dollar-based leverage and sanctions risk. That shared exposure creates incentives for financial cooperation. Russia's isolation from Western financial systems accelerated this transformation faster than expected. When access to SWIFT and Western banks was restricted, Moscow adapted under pressure. Domestic payment systems were expanded and non-dollar trade channels were prioritized. Survival replaced efficiency as the primary goal. China observed these developments while advancing its own long-term strategy. Beijing understood that monetary power requires infrastructure rather than declarations. The yuan's international role expanded, slowly through trade settlement. Rather than reserve replacement, parallel systems were built quietly to function when traditional channels failed. The cross-border interbank payment system became a critical tool in this strategy. It allowed international yuan transactions without full reliance on Western clearing networks. Adoption grew steadily across Asia, Africa, and parts of Latin America. Reliability mattered more than speed or size. Energy trade became the most effective testing ground for non-dollar systems. Oil and gas transactions involve predictable volume and strategic necessity. Russia and China began settling large energy contracts in local currencies. Once proven viable, the model attracted attention from other producers. The petrodollar system did not collapse, but it began to show flexibility. Certain energy contracts introduced alternative settlement options quietly. This shift reduced the psychological permanence of dollar-only pricing. Once flexibility exists, expansion becomes easier. India's role highlights the complexity of the transition. New Delhi avoids formal blocks while protecting strategic autonomy. At the same time, rupee-based trade with Russia expanded significantly. Pragmatism outweighed alignment. Brazil approached de-dollarization from an efficiency perspective rather than ideology. Dollar settlement increases transaction costs and exchange risk. Local currency trade with China reduced friction for exporters. Economic logic drove policy decisions. South Africa provided geographic and institutional diversity to the BRICS framework. As a financial gateway to Africa, it linked alternative systems to emerging markets. African economies increasingly explore non-dollar settlement options. Each step strengthens system resilience. Interest in expanding BRICS membership reflects changing global incentives. Countries seek insulation from sanctions and policy volatility. The goal is diversification rather than confrontation. Optionality is the real attraction. Mainstream analysis often misreads this strategy. BRICS is not attempting to replace the dollar overnight. It is reducing dependence gradually until alternatives become normal. This distinction defines the entire shift. The United States retains unmatched financial depth and liquidity. Treasury markets remain the world's safest assets. No alternative currently matches that scale, but dominance weakens when exclusivity fades. When trade can occur without touching the dollar, leverage decreases. Sanctions become selective rather than universal. Economic pressure becomes less predictable. Control transforms into negotiation. American policy increasingly relies on enforcement rather than persuasion. Trade restrictions and secondary sanctions aim to slow alternative systems. The objective is cost escalation rather than reversal. Whether this succeeds remains uncertain. Financial systems rarely collapse suddenly. They erode through adaptation and fragmentation. The British pound followed this path over decades. The dollar now faces similar evolutionary pressure. Technology accelerates this process faster than historical precedent. Payment platforms scale rapidly without political alignment. Economic necessity alone drives adoption. Speed replaces tradition. Even close allies quietly explore alternatives as insurance. These moves are framed as risk management rather than defiance. That framing makes resistance difficult. Quiet change proves durable. This phase of the story is not about collapse but transition. The global financial system is bending under cumulative pressure. Once systems bend far enough, reversal becomes unlikely. Momentum replaces intention. In the next part, we examine how the United States is responding to this shift. We analyze policy tools, enforcement strategies, and financial realignment efforts. We assess whether these measures restore dominance or delay redistribution. And we explore what this transition means for the future global order. As pressure on the dollar increases, the United States has shifted its strategy from quiet confidence to active defense. Financial dominance is no longer assumed as permanent. Washington now treats currency leadership as a contested space. This change marks a significant departure from past decades. The primary American response focuses on reinforcing existing institutions rather than creating new ones. The Federal Reserve remains central to global liquidity through swap lines with allied central banks. These arrangements ensure dollars remain available during crises. Access reinforces loyalty. Trade agreements are increasingly linked to financial compliance. Market access is conditioned on regulatory alignment and payment transparency. This ties economic opportunity to dollar participation. Influence becomes structural rather than diplomatic. Sanctions enforcement has also expanded in scope and speed. Secondary sanctions now target facilitators rather than just governments. This increases compliance costs for global firms. Fear becomes a policy instrument. However, enforcement carries unintended consequences over time. Each sanction episode reinforces the perception of risk. Countries begin planning for scenarios where access is denied. Preparation becomes rational rather than political. This creates a paradox for American policy. Stronger enforcement preserves short-term leverage. At the same time, it accelerates long-term diversification. Control today plants exit incentives tomorrow. Technology further complicates enforcement strategies. Digital payment platforms reduce reliance on correspondent banking. Transactions move faster than regulatory oversight. Control lags behind innovation. Central bank digital currencies represent the next frontier. They promise direct settlement without intermediaries. If adopted widely, they bypass traditional clearing systems. Power shifts toward system designers. China and other BRICS members invest heavily in these technologies. Their goal is not dominance, but independence. Functionality matters more than recognition. Systems only need to work. The future global financial order is unlikely to revolve around a single currency. Instead, multiple systems will coexist with overlapping functions. The dollar will remain important but less exclusive. Dominance will be shared rather than absolute. This fragmentation increases complexity for global trade. Companies must navigate multiple settlement systems. Hedging strategies become more sophisticated. Efficiency declines, but resilience improves. For developing economies, this shift offers both opportunity and risk. Diversification reduces vulnerability to external pressure. At the same time, fragmented systems increase transaction costs. Balance becomes essential. The BRICS initiative does not promise stability or simplicity. It offers optionality in an uncertain world. That optionality attracts countries facing volatility. Choice becomes power. The United States still holds immense advantages. Financial trust, legal predictability, and market depth remain unmatched. These strengths ensure continued relevance. But relevance is no longer exclusivity. History suggests that dominant systems fade gradually rather than collapse suddenly. Adaptation replaces revolution. Transition unfolds quietly across decades. Power redistributes without headlines. The dollar's future will be shaped by choices made today. Enforcement may delay erosion, but cannot eliminate alternatives. Cooperation could preserve influence without coercion. Strategy determines outcome. What we are witnessing is not the end of the dollar. It is the end of uncontested monetary dominance. A multipolar financial world is emerging slowly. Adjustment defines survival. This shift will reshape trade, diplomacy, and economic planning. Nations will hedge rather than commit fully. Flexibility will outweigh loyalty. Stability will be negotiated rather than assumed. Understanding this transition is essential for interpreting modern geopolitics. Currency is no longer just money. It is infrastructure, power, and security. And it is now contested. The battle between BRICS and the dollar is not fought on trading floors alone. It unfolds through systems, standards, and settlement mechanisms. Victory is measured in resilience rather than collapse, and the outcome remains unfinished. Thank you for watching.